You should record that.
Yeah, there we go.
Um, is anyone else here on this call going to AGU? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I'll be there.
Yep.
Okay,
I
sweet.
shall be there as well.
Oh, cool. Beautiful.
Nice. Well, then I'll see a few of you there in person. Um, yeah, can't really think of anything that's too important to bring up with this group, so I'll just pass, I think.
Yeah, that's fine by me. Okay, cool. All right, well, topic of today, sprung up by I almost said spring meeting. That's not the time of year it is right now. My brain's not working today. But
It's
software,
spring somewhere, Julie.
I'm envious. It's too cold. Any hoodle. But software licenses and how we want to handle that in PyHC and, helping get this information ironed out so that when John writes FEPs for all of these standards, we can make this easier. So take it away, John.
Crap, I'd forgotten that the agreement to write the FEPS includes the licenses. And clearly that's why everybody's here. Oh, sorry, I
Clearly.
keep on forgetting I'm about to share screen on Zoom, which means I need to do weird stuff so I can still see my screen. Oh, sorry, one of these days I'm going to remember to do this in advance. Alrighty, let's see there. So I can see my screen. Can the rest of you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So this is hopefully going to be a couple of minutes of table setting, and then we're going to, I don't know, continue to tie ourselves in knots over Numis being a pain in the neck. Um, um, so I imagine that I'm going to be telling some of you some stuff that you've already heard, so apologies for that. Um, Basically, there's like three parties that talk about what's a good license. That goes from the FSF that have this free software definition. That's kind of where the idea got started. Um, there's the Debian free software guidelines, which was for a while a pretty practical consideration because that was, hey, is this going to be something you can actually put into Debian and thus into Ubuntu? That's become less of an issue with uh, the space that we move in just because we're largely working with pip rather than stuff packed for the distribution. And then there's the OSI open source definition, which was sort of trying to separate out the idea of license analysis from any particular project. And also, this is part of holy wars of the early 2000s that nobody needs to hear about, but an attempt to be a little bit more business friendly in the open source software space. So there's that list, and there's that license proliferation report that we had talked about at the meeting. OSI's proliferation report kind of broke things down into a few categories. There's the popular and widely used, which several of these will look familiar. Apache, BSD, GPL, MIT. They specifically call it GPL2 because the original form of this report was before GPL3. They have a category that's special purposes or special concerns. That includes NOSA. There's a redundant category, a non-reusable category because it's specific to the authors. That includes the Python license. And that's literally just because the license says the Python Software Foundation XYZ grants you as opposed to more generic wording. But then supersede and voluntarily retire. So generally what they really recommend is you kind of play in this popular and widely used space. What's of interest to us in terms of the conversations we're having, there's the permissive licenses, there's the copyleft, and then there's NOSA because it just has to be on its own. Permissive ones are pretty straightforward. That's BSD and MIT that we're pretty familiar with, also Python software. These generally don't have any restrictions on the use of the software and have very few restrictions on the distribution of the software. In particular, there's no requirement to distribute the source. So yeah, we're all handing out our source code with our projects, but there's no requirement that anybody else who gets it has to hand it on. So mostly the license is just making sure that things have proper attribution and that there's no warranty. So by analogy, for people who play in Creative Commons space, this is sort of the Creative Commons attribution license. You can do pretty much whatever you want, including keep other people from doing things. later on down the line, but you just have to not claim it as your own. Okay, copyleft is where it gets fun. So the GPL is really the main case of this. Here's the key requirement. If you distribute a binary, and GPL is really tied up in binary versus source. So if you distribute a binary and there's a GPL code anywhere in the stack, so you've got some BSD code that calls some MIT code that calls some GPL code, and you give somebody this compiled stack, you also have to make the source available to them. And then they have to do the same. If they pass the binary on to somebody else, they have to pass the source on. There is not a requirement that you relicense. You don't have to have all the stuff actually be GPL licensed, but in practice, that pass it along requirement means you kind of pick up a GPL on the way. But if you take just your BSD code or just your MIT code, you can still pass that on and do whatever you want. So effectively, you want to be dual licensed. This winds up with all sorts of complicated implications. For instance, you have provide source the entire stack. Well, what about if you're distributing code that's meant to run on Windows? There's an exception for that. If it's for the operating system, there's an exception for the GCC runtime. All sorts of convoluted stuff that is great source for evening arguments, but not much else. Ultimately, the idea here was to try to hack the copyright law, to use copyright law as a way of enforcing sharing. Part of that is hey, you can't take my source code, compile, and give somebody just the binary. But then it's also the ultimate end goal was that we're going to have so much fantastic GPL software that nobody would bother writing any software without it, and that would be the end of proprietary software, and we would all be, frolicking in the fields. Didn't quite. If you'd like to play in the Creative Commons space, this is sort of the Creative Commons share alike. There's all sorts of variants. There's GPL v3, which is trying to address patents, and there's the Affero GPL, which is attempting to address web services. But the short here is that there is some restriction on if you start to stream binaries, you have to provide source. That kind of goes along. And so there's interactions between licenses of different pieces of code that make it pretty complicated to do the right. And finally, there's no send. I didn't see Rebecca on, so this will be fun. So is NoSo free? Well, FSF says no, because there's a requirement that the changes have to be your original creation. So you can't go and take other open core code, contribute to a NoSo licensed project, even if you would be able to do that under the license of that code. The OSI says, yes, it's free. And basically their hand wavy thing is, well, the US government has to do weird stuff, so we're just going to let them do it. And the Debian free software guidelines has never ruled on this, but the analysis was basically, we don't know. This to me is really the best quote of the whole conversation. It is awfully confusing. I'm not sure it will stand up in court. There's other fun stuff. There's a prohibition in NOSA for using the software to do anything illegal, which actually is kind of a violation of the OSI definition. You can't place restrictions on how the program is used. So the fun example of this is the JSON.org license says the software should be used for good and not evil, which makes it a really non-free license. So that's fun. Other fun with NOSA, it does require distribution of the source code. If you have something that's BSD licensed, you can give somebody just the binary and life is good. NOSA requires you to distribute the source if you distribute binaries. It doesn't go all the way up and down the stack like GPL, but there's that requirement. You have to identify the source of every modification, and everybody who provides any sort of modification has to provide explicit consent. I think this is part of what Rebecca was talking about. There's also a request that anybody who uses the software register it. So it's in this document of legally binding requirements. There's this, well, we ask you to do this, but you don't have to. So there's lots of bits of weirdness there. that make it not necessarily difficult to use or to call NOSA licensed code, but distribution in particular modification. It's weird. So that's what I've got. Just wanted to sort of lay out a little bit of that because I think we've had a lot of conversations where we're trying to think about outcome, and we've had discussions about, well, what's the actual problem with any of this stuff, and just trying to show, at least from my perspective, what can be the complications there. And I think ultimately the question is, to what degree do we want to accept NOSA, and to what degree do we want to accept copyleft licenses?
Yeah, thanks for that. That definitely, that's one of the, yeah, that helps keep track of what the differences are in my head because I'm still new to getting my head wrapped around that. Real quick, can you go back a little bit to where you were talking about the how JSONs had the do no evil clause and how that made it, you said not technically an open source license? I didn't quite follow that point.
Yeah, this is weird. Let me go pull that up. So the OSI definition says that basically there can't be restrictions on the use of the program. So you can't publish something under under a license where the license says you can share this, you can compile it, you can modify it, you can redistribute it, but you're not allowed to use it in weapons. You're not allowed to use it for this. You're not allowed to use it for that.
So it just has to be allowed to be used for literally anything in the world.
Yeah. And the FSF definition and the Debian definition have similar components because otherwise, yeah, you get into really weird situations where you're allowed to have the code, you're allowed to modify it, but you're not allowed to run it in certain situations. And so, yeah, but the weird case where this has come up is the JSON org license is the big one, but it's happened a couple other cases where people have explicitly said in their license, this must be used for good and not for evil. And technically, it's not meeting the open source definition if you're not allowed to use it for evil.
Well, all right then. I mean, I guess I kind of see it just because how do you like enforce saying you can do anything else? I don't know.
Yeah, it becomes very difficult to say you're allowed to modify the software, but you're not allowed to use it in certain ways. And so ultimately that's why they've um, the decision has been made to avoid that sort of thing. This kind of came up initially with people, BSD being a Berkeley thing. People were wanting to prohibit military uses of free software, and it just became not reasonable.
Yep. And so, and then the no, yes, and the maybe are whether or not these three different groups actually consider NOSA licenses to be open source.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep. Well, I see the argument, and it makes sense why this one is controversial now.
Do we have any idea which ones are the least controversial?
Oh yeah. That's really easy. The permissive licenses in this popular and widely used. So really Apache, BSD, MIT. There are a couple of other like weird ones in this category that, I mean, if Apache, BSD, or MIT don't do it for you, um, then there's something weird going on.
So I was having this discussion about which license the other week, and I think I ended up settling on 3-clause BSD. So I guess I'm not in too much hot water.
Yeah, for some reason, the lawyers tend to really like BSD. That tends to be one that is um, almost always easier to get past tech transfer. Although my understanding is NASA, I think, has a preference for Apache at this point if you're able to get them off NOSA.
Well, do we know if we've even had a PyHC package that was trying to use a NOSA license yet? I've never seen one.
That's me.
I was gonna say there's one.
Oh, that's Komodo.
Yep.
Was that part of your NASA requirements or something? How did that
That,
happen?
that's the default that every open source package is pushed into. And you have to go to great lengths to not be part of it, part of NOSA. That's just what NASA pushes every open source into. That's their license. It's a NASA license.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And
Okay,
Darren,
so we're in this big years of open science push from NASA, but then they've come through and specially made an open source license for everyone to use that we don't like.
Makes sense.
Whoops.
well, I think it's consistent with a lot of um, NASA's view of software, which is that it is a product that gets provided to NASA or provided from NASA, and that this collaborative thing is relatively new. You know, a lot of folks at NASA have been trying to operate in this mold, but it's not what institutionally is easy.
Yeah, I mean, my take on it seems to be that people just aren't talking to each other because we had a information session about the NOSA license a few weeks ago, and they seemed completely unaware of the open source push from headquarters, like the TOPS program and things like that. And I suspect that it's just these are two different plans that were come up with individually and being pushed down from separate channels.
So Darren, am I remembering correctly that Apache is possible, but an incredible uphill battle?
I haven't looked into. Everyone who's talked to me has said it's hard to get that changed, but I don't know
I
the
imagine
details of that.
relicensing after the fact is particularly hard.
Yeah, so I don't know. I just everything I've heard is just it's unlikely, and you've got to have a really good reason why you're not using the default, because every other package in NASA uses it. So why are you bucking the trend, right? There's several hundred open source licenses of NASA software out there already. So
I wonder if us not recommending it would help in that battle or not.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking too. Like, what ramifications are there if PyHC says we don't want to support this one? This seems, I mean, clearly I would not be playing nicely with NASA, so they might get a little bit upset from the get-go.
I mean,
I
I
don't know.
absolutely think
I don't know if Komodo has enough of a market for them to say, well, it's only going to affect 15 people, so don't worry about it. I don't know. I'm just, throwing out straw, arguments here, but it's not like we have hundreds of users that are all clamoring to use it and complaining to NASA, right? And so I don't know what it would take to push that change.
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, we certainly shouldn't recommend it. The question is just how dire the consequences are. Because I can see somebody like I think the thing we can absolutely unequivocally exclude is if somebody is going and is not a NASA contractor or civil servant and wants to go and release something and goes, well, I'm on NASA funding, so why don't I just use NOSA? That's what we want. And that's the real um, danger.
Well, when we started this project, one of the ways we justified even being open source at all was that one of the contributors was not NASA. At the time, it was like if everyone's inside NASA, we don't need to do open source.
Oh,
And so we basically said, hey, well, I mean, at the time I was funded through University of Michigan. And so they're like, well, we've got a non-NASA person contributing here. We have to at least go open source. And they said, oh, okay, then. Right. So even back, and this is, 4 years ago or 5 years ago, we were getting this going. They didn't even want to do open source for us.
Mm.
Does anyone, because I remember Rebecca being particularly vocal about this, Rebecca Ringette. Does anyone remember if she was pushing for just no acceptance of NOSA or limited?
I'm pretty sure it was the latter.
The latter, yeah. Because I mean, I could imagine going as far as like reaching out to people who are using NOSA licenses and asking how much they hate it and being like, do you want PyHC to fight in your corner and have us make some kind of policy and take it back to NASA and do this whole fight? Or we could just take a more moderate approach, ruffle less feathers, and just do something like we allow it, but we could specifically include a couple sentences in whatever document we write that explain our qualms with the license. Like, use a NOSA license if NASA makes you, but we don't like aspects X, Y, and Z of it.
Try for Apache instead.
Yeah, I mean, advertising dislike of NOSA, I think, is certainly a start, even independent of a specific package, just to kind of get that out there in the community that, hey, NASA, this is kind of a lousy, you know, way you're playing this game.
I think it makes it.
I already fully anticipate that Komodo is going to drop into bronze in the new, just because of other reasons of things that I'm not yet meeting. So to say I can be included and drop me in bronze, but the only way to move up is if I can fight with NASA and NOSA, is at least that's kind of the, if NASA wants me to have a little more profile, they're going to have to do some things to help me, right? But
Sure.
And that's a good point. It would be kind of a shame for us to, I think, be trapping packages in like a bronze status if like the only thing stopping them was NASA wouldn't let them change their license. Something about that situation feels bad to me.
But it does make it really hard to contribute. I mean, I'm looking at this now, I'm looking at more detail and going, like, personally, it's one thing, but I'm also worried about what representations I'm making on behalf of my institution, right? Because most of us are at institutions that claim some level of interest in all of our intellectual output. And most places are pretty good at shrugging off, oh yeah, I did this thing and I did it for my work because of XYZ and it's going BSD and okay, yeah, whatever. But some of those required certifications and statements are, doing on my behalf is one thing, but doing on behalf of the institution is another thing.
well, and I mean, a lot of us are, there's the letter of the NOSA law and there's kind of the practical of it, right? And it's like, we're not going through every little thing and requiring that. I don't think that's reasonable. I may get nabbed and thrown in jail at some point in the future, but I'm certainly not following that to the letter of the law in our development. This is recorded. Oh shoot, no.
For legal purposes, that was a joke.
Yeah.
Yeah, is it enough of a stick towards NASA if we won't allow people to reach the higher echelons of our tiers because of this? Because we're not going to outright say you can't be a part of PyHC if you have NOSA. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
I think one of the considerations was also you know, we've been talking a lot about no, so there's the GPL question. I know a lot of people felt very weird about the idea of like NOSA being treated more gently than GPL.
Sure.
And I'm picturing who would actually be like the team of humans we'd be butting heads against if we went back to NASA and even attempted to have anything in this license changed. And I'm picturing anything from like a small team of people to like a giant army of government lawyers. And something tells me it's probably more that.
I think to Jeff's point, there's the open science people and there's the tech transfer and software release process people. And um, I don't think the open science people are managing to get leverage on the army of lawyers.
Gotcha.
We can add to their voices.
I mean, we could try just contacting Steve Crawford and asking him. I'm sure Rebecca's been talking to him, but it would be worth just asking him, look, what are the implications if we adopted this policy or that policy?
Mhm. I mean, having met him, he's really nice and open, so I don't think.
Oh, he is. I just don't know if he's got any political capital he can spend on this.
Yep.
I think Rebecca knows him better than most people here. Could ping her and ask her.
It, I got the impression from her was that I don't want to speak for her, but her amount of political capital on this is limited. That she's been fighting the fight and is maybe not the person who's going to be heard more in the room. I can drop him a line because I've had a few interactions with him where Julie, if you want to, as PI.
Sure. Yeah, that probably falls onto my plate.
What role
Now,
does Steve Crawford play again? I'm forgetting what he does.
Oh, I know he's at HQ, but what's his
he
thing?
wrote SPD 41A.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, sweet. Yep, that's an important one.
So Julie, I can send you a few words that kind of summarize the concerns, and you can take that as something to, mold into an email if that makes sense.
Yeah, that'd be great. Okay.
Interesting. Well, there's some outcomes already that I've heard is email to someone important at NASA to just ask a first question about this whole NOSA thing. And I think we had fairly universal agreement a minute ago about including some kind of language in whatever FEP we write that just describes what we don't like about it, pretty much. Um,
Yeah, at a minimum, we should discourage it somehow. Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
So it seems like some of these clauses, things that are mentioned in NOSA would, if NASA were to use it themselves, would uh, add a significant amount of forward liability for NASA as well. I wonder if people there have really fully thought that through. That might be an angle to get them to think about if it's really what they want.
That's it.
yeah.
Okay. Hmm. We landed on the general agreement that it's not recommended. Are we allowing people to get to the highest points of PyHC if they do have it? Is that a hill we're dying on?
I would say that probably depends on the outcome of your conversation with Steve.
It's true. All
I
right.
think that way is what you can say. We want to discourage this, so we are considering making it a hard barrier.
Mhm.
Um,
For XYZ reasons.
yeah, is this something? I mean, it's the, I, sorry, this is recorded, but I just can't help think, LBJ had the analogy of like, do you want somebody outside your tent pissing in or inside your tent pissing out? And it's, what gives us the best ability to move things in the direction we want? Is it by holding a hard line and saying you can't play at this level, or is it by saying, well, you can, but we're going to discourage it and I'll continue to apply pressure from the inside?
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Well, I think that's as far as decisions on this can be made right now.
Right.
Hopefully, Steve can give us a positive answer or say, I have no power, resend this to X.
Yep.
And we can do something, we can have pretty firm restriction of like, something like only on existing projects, right? Not on new projects, or only if you have some sort of corporate policy that keeps you from doing it or something like that. And I think we could probably do similar with GPL.
I would think that'd be fine.
Do folks have other feelings on GPL?
Hearing no dissent, it is law.
All right. So hopefully easier stuff. Do we agree that silver level is accessible to these non-recommended licenses? It would only be at gold that if we have a hard requirement, it would come in there.
I agree with that.
That was also my gut reaction. Like I was saying earlier, it feels like it would be a shame if just a licensing issue kept a package at bronze.
Yeah, because silver is where things like summer school inclusion starts being possible, and it'd be a shame if one we'd had, example, Komodo at like every summer school suddenly was like, nope.
And did we have the absolute floor for bronze is an OSI license, right?
I'm pretty sure that's where we landed.
Because if you don't have a license, then you're definitely going in the under evaluation category. And if it's a non-open source license, then also still probably under evaluation.
Yeah. I 100% remember agreement in the room that it needed to be an open source license. I just don't remember if OSI's definition of an open source license is what we landed on, or if we were using a more broad definition.
OSI's is probably the most reasonable. I mean, we could use FSF's definition and leave those out.
But yeah, I think I would agree that OSI's is the most reasonable. Were there any other controversial license types that needed to be discussed today, or is NOSA really like the big elephant in the room?
I think NOSA and GPL were the big hinge points.
That's all I really remember from our discussions at the fall meeting. So maybe it is that simple.
Yeah, I guess the only question is, do we get even more restricted? Do we just say, OSI and permissive, or do we talk about, I'd like to push people into that category of popular and widely used. But that feels like a weaker thing, more of a recommendation than a must.
Yeah.
As the maintainer of a package with not one of those licenses, because we thought Python with Software Foundation would be a good idea.
Well, are we running out of discussion then?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is as far as we can take it at this point. Hopefully it gives you some more ideas for when this is brought up in the FEP, because I'm pretty sure the idea had been to strip that out of FEP for the tiering and do what we're doing for other standards that you're rewriting about, which is say, look to future standards for decisions on levels. Whenever that happens, we can add that column to the PyHC page.
I was just starting to think that, well, I mean, I'm curious enough to see the response from Steve Crawford that I'd kind of like to be CC'd on the email chain, but I also don't know. It's a little bit of a sensitive topic, so if you prefer to just keep it between you two, I'm okay with that too.
I think I'll probably keep it a little more restricted.
Hmm. Maybe just like let me and John know, like offline, maybe through Slack or something, if you get a response.
Sure.
It can probably go into the GitHub discussion too.
Yeah. Either way, we'll be made aware of the result.
I'm not expecting there to be too much of an actionable result. I'm expecting just like, I don't know, maybe a little bit of legalese and a little bit of like, oh, this could be an uphill battle, but might be surprised. I mean, for the man who wrote NASA's open source policy, he already maybe he already secretly hates NOSA licenses and would be super happy that an organization is reaching out to say something about it. Who knows?
Yeah, I'm not sure myself. I'll remain hopeful. Okay, cool. Well, I feel like there's nothing further that we can talk about right now, and opinions have been captured. So we could go ahead and wrap. Um, there's another telecon, the last one of the whole year in 2 weeks, same time, same place. And that one, Nick is spearheading. It has to do with the PyHC user survey, and trying to workshop that and figuring out, what we want in it and so forth. So be there or be square.
Pete?
All
Yeah,
right.
I'll see you and AGU next week.
Yeah. And yeah, safe travels to everyone making it out to DC.